Welcome to day 7. First of all, today we have Nicola Smalley from And Other Stories. I'd never met Nicola before and this was an absolute joy. We sort of covered, she also wins the award for best background. Hands down, go watch that video just for her background. And we just had a really good time. And Other Stories publish some really wonderful contemporary literature, and I really, it was really interesting. We had a really interesting discussion about sort of the constraints of the publishing industry and sort of doing what you can to change it, whilst still having to be within the overall like capitalist publishing system, and sort of the tension could be a bit of a buzzword for the whole festival, between the two things pulling you, but it's a really lovely conversation. And Other Stories, you should go check them out. Then we had Tinashe Musha Kavanu, who talks about his blog Reading Zimbabwe, and then just a bit more generally about sort of like archiving and the importance of archiving memories, and what else? How do I describe that one? It's really, really interesting. It gave me a lot to think about afterwards, and in particular, sort of he was able to engage with some questions that I've been thinking on sort of like indigenous and minority endangered languages, and how sort of important they are, and how they root a person's identity, and sort of as we lose them, people lose personhood, and that sort of translation generally exists primarily in, not primarily in, but the literature industry exists in the colonial languages, and like what would it look like to talk more and to publish more that was in and out of other languages. That's a very roundabout way of saying that one's a really good talk. And then we have Carleen from Sign Solutions. So after Carleen interpreted our talk with Adam, we thought, well, we're a translation festival, let's talk to Carleen next. Carleen is a sign language interpreter, and she talks about her work, and specifically Carleen's expertise is in education, and so we talk specifically about education and educational needs, and what sort of best serves people who are deaf, and what sort of what do they want and need. And then she also, she's just a gem of a person, so that was a really, really enjoyable 30 minutes. I really recommend that talk for anyone who's interested, and I think we all should be interested, not as like a judgment, but as like a, sign languages are amazing, and I think that you should go check that one out and you might enjoy it. Thank you so much for joining me on day 7. I shall see you tomorrow. Bye.
I mean, I would love it if we just, our books could go to libraries and everybody could just borrow library books, and that, if that could like sustain. I mean, what I would love is for there to be like a fraction of the number of books that are published. If a fraction of the number of books that are published were published and they were all really good. And they were just circulated via libraries, and everybody, read the same books, and or not read the same books, but read the same physical copies, and like it wasn't like each person having like hundreds of books on their shelves that like most of them never get read. Like, I mean, I have to own up to this. That's not very sustainable. But like, we live in a horrible capitalist society, and there's no way of getting away from it. Like, unless there's major structural change, it's very difficult to.
And the structural change is in shifting from the structural change that like you are a part of is the one that you can affect, which is like making sure that people who aren't getting heard are getting heard. And that's sort of like, that's a thing that you can do in capitalism, whereas like actually like changing, moving away from a consumer based book model is not something as a couple of people in a room that is as achievable.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something you mentioned, which was that the financial crisis led to sort of more conservatism from the big publishers. Do you think that that's continued? Like, do you think that sort of actually maybe there was like a reaction there, not that they weren't pretty conservative maybe before as well, but that actually maybe that's played out? Or do you think there's been any shifts in sort of the wider publishing scene in the last sort of, what would that be, 10, 12, 13 years?
Yeah. I definitely think that there's been a massive shift since we started. So we published our first books in 2011, which means we're 10 this year. And, you know, there were other small publishers, lots of them in the US, but also in the UK. Pyrini started around the same time that we did. I think they were maybe a year before us or something. And, you know, there have been like lots of other small publishers, CB Editions. I'm not going to list them because I'll inevitably forget most of them. But since we started, there's been like a boom, you know, like lots and lots of small publishers. And now there's an amazing kind of range. You know, there's like publishers for almost like every region of the world, but also, you know, lots and lots of like doing lots of different things, not just doing the kind of more difficult or like, what's the word, like I don't know, sort of boundary pushing work that we publish, but also, you know, people like Arenda who are doing like lots of crime literature and translation, and
Bitter Lemon.
Yeah, Bitter Lemon, exactly, and Gallic, and you know, like it's, you know, it's like just being an indie publisher doesn't mean you're doing difficult books, you know, like you're just doing different. I mean, you might be doing, often you're doing books that then get picked up by a bigger publisher when they finally, you know, when they realize that actually, oh, these do sell. But I think even in the like bigger publishing, there is still, and in fact, increasingly in the last few years since, or like, I think with what's happened over the last year and a half, I think there's going to be maybe more conservatism, just because it's become more difficult to, it's become more difficult to market books unless you're really putting everything behind a particular book. And so the big publishers, you're seeing that like they're really kind of going for certain trends and like, you know, really kind of, you know, investing in like particular writers. They're investing a lot of time and energy and money in particular writers.
The question of language in the African context in general it's a very important question. We cannot, you know, think about language without thinking about the history of colonialism, the history of exploitation, the history of appropriation, you know. And unfortunately, I am part of a generation that has had to deal with the consequences, you know, of that history. Because it violates sensibility, it violates my sense of being and identity, and I think, yeah, as an intellectual, you know, these are things that I think deeply about. But I think increasingly I am interested in questioning, you know, the sort of homogeneity that language, you know, also forces upon us. You know, so the impression one always has is that Zimbabwe is a country of 3 languages, which is not the case. You know, there are multiple languages that have either been co-opted into these sort of 3 main languages, and increasingly, I'm interested in questioning that sort of uniform, universal, those universal claims of the kind of the languages that we have to use. I mean, in my case, I was raised with English as pretty much one of my primary languages, and so I've co-opted it into my thinking. I've co-opted it into my being, in ways that my own father and my own grandfather cannot relate to the language, because they were either born and raised in a context that those very languages discriminated against them, and limited their choices in life. So when I look at this sort of line, this genealogical line of my own family, we all don't relate to these languages the same way, because they either evoke, painful memories, or they either evoke a sense of displacement of oneself to their own identity. And so these are things that I'm increasingly interested in, to sort of problematize these questions about language and identity, because I think it's very important. I mean, it's quite interesting, when I just mentioned I love Wales. I was fascinated to live in Wales when I was doing my master's degree, because of the sense of bilingualism, that surrounds you. Whether I go to supermarkets where there are two languages that welcomes me, or I'm driving from London or from Bristol into Wales, and there's a sign that says Croeso and the sign that says welcome. That always fascinated me. But we don't have that sense of bilingualism or that sense of multilingualism in a country like Zimbabwe, because one language is always overemphasized over the others. So you will never find signs that gives you that sense of possibility, that you can be welcomed in 5 languages or in 13 languages. So there are all these like problems, intellectual problems, that I am trying to engage with, that I'm increasingly interested in. Because now, for example, when people ask me, who am I? What are you? They always ask me either I'm Shona or Ndebele, and I say I'm not. I'm neither. I'm neither of them, because I am Ndau. And then people say to me, "Oh, you're Ndau." Ndau is a dialect of Shona, but Ndau is not a dialect of Shona. It's always been its own language, and because of the way that our politics has framed these languages, every other language has become a dialect of the dominant languages. I think what I'm essentially saying is I'm increasingly interested in locating myself in this sort of multilingual canvas of Zimbabwe, in the languages that are not visible to the rest of the world, but are visible to myself. When I visit my grandmother, she speaks in a very specific, she has a very specific accent. She speaks in Dao. So every time I have to go and visit my grandmother, I have to switch my mind to a very specific language, that I can't speak, but I can only locate on my grandmother's tongue, which is quite interesting. So language is important, but I mean, the unfortunate part is Zimbabwe. That was also been the plan. The plan has been to locate these languages, and unfortunately, a lot of the other languages from Zimbabwe have very little written literature, very little published literature, and for me, that's increasingly becoming a concern, because it means that the more they go unwritten, the likely that they die or disappear. So I think there's a way in which the work I'm doing is also trying to recover these languages. And yeah, it's not very obvious when you arrive on readingzimbabwe.com, but as it exists, the site is more than 25 languages, because I'm increasingly interested, not just in the local languages that people speak or that people use to describe themselves, but I'm also interested in how the world reads and interprets Zimbabwe. So some of those 25 languages include, Hungarian, Japanese, Chinese, Dutch, even Welsh. So I'm interested in sort of how translation, how a country is read in translation, and what is lost or gained, out of those sort of mediated linguistic experiences.
You see it happen when you're interpreting. It might be somebody's staff meeting or a training course, and you're interpreting for your deaf client, and something will be said, and you can make it very visual, and you see all eyes come onto you because they're thinking, actually, if I watch the interpreter at this moment, I might know what that was. Because they're relying on me knowing what it was. But yeah, it does happen. Oh, and also people love a swear word or a rude sign. If that comes out ever, all eyes are on the interpreter. Like, how's she going to deal with that?
Do you ever make any judgments about sort of changing what was said? Because obviously we would change anything in any interpreting, translating, things change and alter, and like the aim is to be faithful to the original in whatever the best way to be faithful is. Do you ever make decisions like that?
Occasionally, yeah. That's like part of our training is about cultural mediation, and that sometimes it's appropriate and other times it isn't. I remember interpreting in a court once, and my deaf client was just using such bad language, just swearing constantly at the judge, and I thought, I'm absolutely going to be voicing what he's signing right now. And the judge got really cross with me, and he said, "Madam Interpreter, I don't appreciate being sworn at." So it's like, well, hold on a minute. This is a case of don't shoot the messenger. But that, I just thought, actually, it's really important that because that I didn't need to culturally mediate that. I didn't need to soften the blow there. That's what he was signing. That's how he felt, that he wanted that directed at the judge, and that was how it was going to be. Yeah. Yeah, so occasionally, but in some circumstances, you just go for it.
That's that example has given me sort of quite a lot to think about. I think that's a very powerful example.
Yeah.
What would you like sort of going forward, and how would you like, is there anything that could make your job as an interpreter easier? What would you like people to know who maybe aren't aware and don't interact with BSL on a daily life or any other signed language?
I do get a little bit frustrated with people that think it's just like a hobby. And sometimes we're in really serious situations. I had one not that long ago. It was a social services type context. It was child protection related. And at the end, I asked who I send my bill to. And they said, "Oh, you're going to charge us for this?" I mean, that's a bit on, I have to accept responsibility that I didn't make all of that clear before I arrived. But I kind of assumed that they would realise that I would want to be paid. And it's not about the money, but it's about kind of respect for, you can't have this meeting without me here. And I think people, sometimes need to realise that and have a little bit more respect for all of the training that we do. And that's very rare. We are, I'm not suggesting that happens very often, but there is a little bit of, well, so what do you actually do for a job? When you've just interpreted somebody's meeting, it's like, well, this actually is my job, and it took me many years to train. And I do have certificates and pieces of paper that say I'm qualified to do this, and and ongoing training, CPD, and making sure that I'm registered and keeping my DBS up to date, and making sure I'm insured. And just to have somebody sort of suggest that this is just like a hobby and you just do this for a bit of fun, and that you must have a real job. I'd like to see that change, and I'd like to see interpreters provided as a matter of course, not because a deaf person's asking for an interpreter, or getting a hard time if they don't turn up for something. So they provide access, they provide an interpreter, and there's nobody deaf there. Well, we're not doing that again because we've paid, and actually, that's that doesn't feel right either.